turn on the recorder. Put it right here.
Is that going to be used at my trial? Thank you all for inviting me, and I got to thank the library. This is a great library. I've been here several times to come to programs or to give programs, and I want to say this is a great organization. This is a super place to do this. I've given it in places where the acoustics are bad or the visuals are bad. It's not set up right. This is a great library, and I want to thank them for inviting me to come up here. Let me give you just a short bio, and then I'm going to jump into the presentation. First thing I ask is, please hold your questions until the end. I'm going to talk fast because I've got so much stuff. And what I did is, the slides you saw in the beginning there when they were just rotating through, those were pre-slides. I couldn't pack everything into this presentation. It would go for 4 or 5 hours. So I tried to pick interesting stuff, and the ones you were watching as they were rotating through were some of the slides I thought would be of interest that I could not put into the program. Give you a little background on me. I joined the Army in 1971 during Vietnam. I served a career in the Army in the infantry. I got out, went back to teaching graduate studies at the Army Command and General Staff College. I got a history degree and taught in the history department, and that was probably the best job I've ever had, was teaching history to military officers. It was fun. You learn so much by teaching because you have to dive into the books and stuff. So I taught the core curriculum course on the American Civil War. I taught the electives. The foreign officers that come to our school every year, there's 100 of them come from foreign countries. I taught them a special elective. They had to take it, and then we took them to Gettysburg to do what's called a staff ride, a study, not a tour. It's a study of the battlefield. So a staff ride's different than tours. I ran the staff ride program at the college where we took our officers to different battlefields around the country. Best job I ever had. And it beats sitting in an office. You can kick dirt clods. You can get rained on. Most of the time the weather was great, but it's a great way to study battles. I belong to several veterans organizations. I belong to Veterans of Foreign Wars, the American Legion, the Cavalry Association, because I had horses and taught riding for years. I loved horses, and I got rid of them when my kids went to college because horses are a black hole. You pour money into them, never get anything back. But I love my horses, they're all gone. I belong to Sons of Confederate Veterans. It's a veterans organization for the descendants of Confederate soldiers. There's a organization that Union soldiers' descendants have. It's called Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. We shorten it to SUV, Sons of Union Veterans. So now that the war's been over so many decades, families have intermarried, and I have friends that are members of Sons of Confederate Veterans because they have Confederate ancestors, and I have friends that are members of Sons of Union Veterans because they had Union Army ancestors. If they are members of both, they are called SOBs, sons of both, not what you thought. It's true. And so what the descendants do is they honor their veteran ancestors by cleaning cemeteries, doing ceremonies, giving presentations, and both of us work together. One of the places I lived was in Leavenworth, Kansas, where I was teaching at the Staff College, and the Sons of Union Veterans and our Confederate Veterans Camp got together, and the biggest battle in Kansas happened at a place called Mine Creek, largest cavalry battle west of the Mississippi River. We went down and we helped restore the battlefield. We worked together. So you're sitting there next to the descendant of a Union soldier as a Confederate descendant. You're working side by side. We help restore the battlefield. So we do projects together to help keep our history alive and remember the veterans of both sides. So I'm a Sons of Confederate Veterans descendant. My ancestors fought for the Confederacy. So that's why I'm a member, and that's what we do. We go out and give programs like this, and you'll see us out on the weekends doing service projects to help restore cemeteries and monuments and things like that. So I'm glad to see a number of friendly faces. I moved to Georgia about a year ago. I'm just north of Fort Benning, Georgia, about 20 miles, a little bitty town called Fortson. We have one traffic light. Most of the people do wear shoes, and it's a great place to live. But I'm back home. My wife's from there. She feels good because the grandkids are there. So we moved after 14 years of being here. I want you to just read this for a second. I'm not going to read it to you. I'll let you read it. And think about what it says. Now, Bruce Cole, the author of this, wrote this article, and this was in it, and I extracted it, is a nationally renowned historian. Unfortunately, he died about 3 years ago, but a great historian. And what he says here is very sad, because it says basically Americans don't know history. Look at the numbers. That's astounding. 57%, that's almost 6 in 10 people perform below basic level in American history in school. It doesn't get better. When they graduate and go on to college, the numbers are just as bad or worse. So we're talking about the educated people in our country not knowing history. And so I always approach the subject looking at, like, what can I learn more? Because I've been studying this, I've been teaching the history of the war for years, decades now, and I still don't know everything. I learn something new every day that I didn't know before. And it's just amazing how much information is buried out there that needs to be discovered. And the more you look, the more you find. I hope tonight, when you leave here, you go, gosh, I didn't know that. And even if you don't agree, and some people don't, and I'm not trying to brainwash you, one of the quotes that you saw in the rotating slides with the lady there talking about her Confederate ancestor, she said, don't believe me, go look it up. And that's what I encourage you to do. What I did do is I brought a bunch of books. These are only a small portion of what I have. I've got more on Black Confederate history, and it's fascinating. There's just so much out there that needs to be discovered. So I hope you get something out of this by just seeing the presentation. Now, one of my friends, Gil White, said, hey, why don't you put a genealogy chart up there, because we both love genealogy. And just explain a little bit about this. So everyone here's got parents, right? Yes? Okay. If you're shaking your head like this, I said, get the guys that check UFOs and see if they have green blood. So everybody's got parents. Then you got grandparents, and you start going over to great-grandparents. How many great-grandparents do you have? Look at that, 8. And then you get to the great-great-grandparents, 16, and then you got 32 great-great-great-grandparents. Who here can name their great-grandparents, all of them? About 7 people. That's impressive. I have to use a cheat sheet to remember their names. That's impressive. Who here can name all 16 of their great-great-grandparents? I can name 1 or 2. And so you see, there's a lot of information out there that we don't know because it's overwhelming. You have to have these charts. And I try to fill these genealogy charts out just to learn who these people are. And then you start researching. So my Confederate ancestors, where you see that number 16, that's where they fall. I don't know them all. And I'm still doing research on them. So there's so much that you have to learn. You know, it's overwhelming. And think about their parents, 32 of them. And that just keeps expanding exponentially. So this is a great topic. If you like genealogy, think about this. How do you know all these people? How do you get to do it? Well, you have to do the research on it. And that's the fun part of what I'm going to be talking about. So, more about me. I'm a certified Army historian. 5X. When I went to a program a couple of years ago, one of the ladies there was reading the credentials. She never asked me what that stood for, and I made a bad assumption. Assumptions are bad. She said 5 times historian. I said, no. That's the Army's lingo. They have codes for you. So if you're an infantry man, you're an 11 Bravo. That's the infantry code that they use. 5 X-ray is a historian code. I was 5 times a historian according to her. I'm going, wow, that's impressive. I'm really just 1 time a historian, but I'm a 5 X-ray. That's a specialty code. So I taught graduate level history. I've been a leadership consultant. I also taught executive leadership. I've written for a number of publications, and I'm still writing, but not as much as I used to. So where did I get my information from? These are just a few sources of information. The photograph by the way, is not from the war. It's not colorized. It's a friend of mine who's a reenactor in Virginia that portrays black Confederates. So when you see these pictures in color, a lot of them are modern reenactors or living history people that do programs. But these are just some of the books, not all of them. They aren't even listing all the books that are over here. This one here by, oh, I don't even have it. I thought it was on there. It's on another slide. Irwin Jordan, this one here. This will knock your socks off. Great book on the history of both blue Union and gray Confederates. Great book, great resource. And you saw on the rotating slides that doctor helped find the ancestor of, help me out, famous artist, music artist.
Spike Lee.
No, not Spike Lee, the one before that slide. Lionel Richard, yes. Richard Lionel. Richie. Lionel Richie. We'll get it for 2 points. Can you take it? Okay, time's up. Okay. I'm not going to read all these quotes to you. I'm going to read a couple of slides, but not all. I want you to take it. These are distinguished historians that are black. Dr. Jordan wrote that book I just held up. And he helped Lionel Richie find his Confederate ancestor. He did the genealogy for him. But the interesting thing about this famous daguerreotype that was made in 1862 or in 1861 is done in New Orleans. When did New Orleans fall to the Union Army?
62.
62. We got a scholar over here for 10 points. 62. So if this was made in 61, think about this. I want to show this to you in a few more minutes. Here's some of the eminent African-American historians who have written about black Confederates. Now, what's really interesting here is Ms. Towns. Anyone here know Peggy Towns? Raise your hand, please. Y'all know her. Wrote a great book about her ancestors, and it's called Duty Driven. If you don't have the book, highly recommend it. Peggy gives a great talk on how to do genealogy. It's a fascinating talk. And what she did is told me that be careful what you look for, because you're going to find stuff that you don't expect. She went looking for her Union Army ancestors. And she's got them. But guess what? She's also got black Confederate ancestors. Shocked her. She had no idea. So she said, be careful when you go looking, because you may find stuff that you aren't really sure you're going to see. But Peggy Towns is a great lady. I believe she lives in Decatur, but she gives great talks. I understand her husband's not doing well, so she may not be out traveling as much. But if you get a chance to get her to come speak, I highly recommend it. And Al Arnold down here at the bottom. Anybody know who Al Arnold is? Raise your hands. 2 people? Okay. Al Arnold's a good friend of mine, fellow Mississippian. We're both from Mississippi. He is a great gentleman. About 2007, he was visiting his grandmother, walking down the stairs of her house, and he noticed this portrait on the wall, a picture. There were a bunch of them, family pictures, and there's this elderly gentleman standing in a suit with a bunch of medals on. And he said, "Who is that?" And she said, "Well, that's your great-great-grandfather, and he was a Confederate soldier." He said, "What?" His jaw hit the floor, bounced about 5 times. He said, "That's impossible. There were no black Confederates." And she said, "Oh, yes, there were, and we've got the documentation." So Al did the research on it, wrote a book. It is a fabulous story about his family. His ancestor was Turner Hall Jr. Turner Hall Jr. had been a slave for Nathan Forrest. At the Battle of Chickamauga, when Longstreet's corps came down to Georgia, somehow or another, he was sold or was given his freedom, went back to Virginia with Longstreet, and was made an orderly for General Lee. So his first book that he wrote is like this, only with the green cover. This is an expanded version. He added more stuff. But he was Robert E. Lee's orderly. He was extremely proud of that. When he died, his pallbearers were white Confederates who lived with him in Oklahoma. He was an honored member of that community. And Al Arnold is very proud of his great-great-grandfather, and he never knew it. He said, you know, the day before he walked into his his grandmother's house, he said, I hated the Confederate flag, I hated Confederates, and now I found out I'm one of them. And so he changed his mind completely and wrote this wonderful book. But Al is a great gentleman. He's come over to speak. We had him at the Civil War Roundtable. He goes around the country giving talks. He has 3 kids. All of them are in the military service. 1 Coast Guard, 1 Air Force, and the other one's in the Army. So he's got what we call a joint family. Great guy. So why were there not black Confederates? And I get a lot of these questions, you know, this is impossible. There couldn't be black Confederates because they would never fight for slavery. That's a common argument. Okay, what about this argument? Blacks were not really soldiers. They were only cooks, servants, teamsters, and laborers. I get that argument a lot too. Only. I mean, that's a real denigration, only. Well, I tell you what, having been a soldier and been in Army units, cooks were my favorite people, because if you didn't have good cooks, you starved to death. Cooks are great people. So only is kind of a denigration. I don't say only, they were cooks. Argument, blacks served to ingratiate themselves to Southerners. Maybe, don't know. No one did an exit poll when they left the Army to ask them that. You know, it's speculation, but that's human nature. Maybe they did. Dr. James McPherson, one of the finest historians on the war in the United States, one of the best historians, says it was complete misidentification. What people saw were bloated, blackened corpses on the battlefield, you know, that had stayed out there. They had rotted. And that's what they identified as black Confederates. That's his argument. And then the last argument that is very common, they were forced to fight. Someone put a bayonet to their back or a gun to their head and said, you have to fight. So I'm going to address each of these briefly. We get back to the basic cause of the war because we go to the argument they wouldn't fight to preserve slavery. Well, the fact is, it was over a year and 3/4 into the war that slavery became an issue of the war. What did Lincoln say when the war started? It's for union, preserve the union. I've looked at hundreds of recruiting posters from that time. Not a single one mentions the word slavery. It talks about union, preserving the union. So the war started off as a preserve the union. And when that's the issue, it's not slavery, then they're not fighting to preserve slavery. The blacks that went out to fight were fighting for a different reason. I'll tell you why in just a second. So one of my colleagues who I taught history with at the Army Staff College said this here. He says, I don't doubt there were blacks who were Confederate soldiers. I don't doubt that. But I do not believe they were anything but cooks and teamsters. And this is a guy who never served a day in the military. So he has a problem here. Because guess what? In the military, in the Army specifically, I can talk about because I served in it. Guess what we have? We have cooks and we have truck drivers, teamsters. They wear the same exact uniform the infantry guys wear, has U.S. Army on it. They get the same pay. Are they not a soldier? Of course they are. So why is that denigration only cooks and teamsters? That's a bad analogy. They are soldiers, and it doesn't matter what their job is. They're getting paid by the government. They're wearing the uniform. They're serving the country. I looked up the definition. I always like to use what the definitions are. Soldier. One engaged in military service, especially in the Army. Sorry to my Marine buddies in here. They mean Marines too. How many Marines we have in here tonight? I know at least 2. Yeah, okay. So it meant Marines too, but we didn't get it in there. Militant leader, follower, or worker. It does. Notice what it does not say. It does not say they have to be formally enlisted. It doesn't say they have to be free. It just says someone engaged in military service. So that's the definition I used. These are federal Teamsters. Remember, they say, well, they were only cooks and Teamsters. Well, wait a second. All these black soldiers who served as Teamsters for the Union Army were not soldiers? If it's good for one side, how about not the other? So if they're doing service for the U.S. Army as Teamsters, they're soldiers. And if they're doing it for the Confederate Army, they're soldiers too. If it's good for one, it's good for the other. How about cooks? This is a award-winning cook right here. He was a national award winner. But according to the denigration of these people by the other side that says there were no Confederate soldiers that were black because they were only cooks. Well, maybe this guy isn't a real soldier because he's only a cook. You see the argument here? He's a cook, he's a soldier. And he won national awards. How about the Navy? We got any Navy vets in here? Navy folks? Yes. My oldest boy was a sailor. My dad was a sailor in World War II. We like Navy. We talk Navy talk. So, Dory Miller. How many of you seen the, I say the newest movie, Pearl Harbor, that came out probably 20 years ago now? Y'all seen that? Okay. Dory Miller's featured in there. And what they show in the movie, even though I rate that movie as one of the worst movies for historical accuracy, they actually portrayed Dory Miller doing what he did to earn the Navy Cross. If you don't know what the Navy Cross is, second highest award to the Medal of Honor. One below. Yes, sir.
There's a carrier coming out, one of the Ford class, named after him.
Good, because he was a true hero. Unfortunately, he later lost his life. His ship was sunk in 1943. This is what I call an unimpeachable source of information. How many of y'all know who Frederick Douglass was? Very famous man, well educated. And he writes to President Lincoln in 1862. And one of my black colleagues who I taught with at the staff college said, well, there were black soldiers, there weren't many. I said, that's not what Frederick Douglass says. He's what I call unimpeachable source of information. He was there at the time. He says there were many. So who's calling him a liar and saying there's not that many? I said, are you telling me that Frederick Douglass doesn't know what he's talking about? And he didn't have a response to that. But, you know, it's good to read these actual quotes from the people who served at the time. James McPherson said they were bloated corpses on the field. Well, here's a bloated corpse 40 years after the war. He's doing pretty good. And I've got dozens of pictures of these men at the reunions. In the slideshow before we got into the program, you saw the quote out of one of the Georgia artillery units said, all the colored members of the unit will be invited to the reunions. They weren't bloated corpses. They were live people. So they say, okay, he was only a body servant. Well, officers had body servants on both sides. It was very common practice in the old Army. This stopped during World War II. In the 1930s, the last time you find records of having body servants. But officers in the pre-World War II Army, this was very common. They had different names. They called them orderlies. And like Robert E. Lee's orderly, Al Arnold's ancestor, an orderly assists that officer with mundane tasks. He does cooking for him maybe. He shines his boots, gets his uniforms prepared, helps. And Turner Hall Jr., Al Arnold's ancestor, took care of his horse. Now guess what we just found out at West Point, New York? They have a portrait of Robert E. Lee in the library, and in the background is Turner Hall leading Robert E. Lee's horse. That's amazing. So these terms are used for the same people. The British Army, they're called batmen, a soldier assigned to the commander to help him. So they aren't just orderlies. They're not just somebody. They are soldiers doing a specific duty for the commander. Now, I like taking the official records. After the war was over, the Union Army collected all the records up on both sides, both the Federal and Confederate, anything that hadn't been destroyed. And over the years, they made over 120 volumes worth of records of all the correspondence in the military. And they have letters, reports. After every battle, commanders were required to write a battle report. This General Stewart is a Union general, wrote this after the battle at Chickasaw Bayou, right outside of Vicksburg. And if you went on the Vicksburg trip with us a couple of years ago with the Tennessee Valley Civil War Roundtable, we went there. How many of you went on that trip? Hundreds of you, yes, thank you. Okay, 2. All right, we went there. And this is what this general says. He says the enemy, and especially their armed Negroes, did dare to rise and fire. The generals back then were not sitting in a rear headquarters. They were out there leading their troops. That's why so many of them were wounded and killed in action, because they were out there. They actually saw this. And General Stewart attests to it in his official report. This is a Union Army general. This is a personal mail of a Union soldier that I found online at an auction that was being sold. It's an original letter. I changed the wording because the words were pretty nasty in the description. It detracts from the message. I want you to read the message, not worry about the nasty language this guy used. But this was sold at auction online. But notice in the yellow highlight there what he says. So, Professor Edward C. Smith just passed away last year. He's the guy that really got me started in an interest of this. He gave a presentation, I watched it, and he talks about Black Confederates. Now, Edward C. Smith was a distinguished black professor at American University in Washington, D.C. Great guy. He did an extensive study in history of blacks during the antebellum period and up through the war. And he did enough analysis to come to a conclusion there were over 60,000 blacks who served with or in the Confederate military during the war. And he says there's no way to tell exactly because so many records were destroyed or they were altered, but he's guesstimating based on numbers that he's extracted and extrapolated from some of the official reports. And I'll show you what those reports say. This is interesting here. Horace Greeley. Who's Horace Greeley? Famous newspaperman, a journalist. Talking about this, it's recorded in his book that he published in 1866. He says that the Confederacy is using it. Why is he doing this? Because at the time he was trying to encourage President Lincoln to enlist black soldiers. This is prior to 1863 when they officially started enlisting. That doesn't mean blacks were not fighting for the Union Army. The first regiment to do so was the 1st Kansas Infantry. It was an all-black regiment out west. And they were fighting in 1861 already. What happened is during the war, a lot of these state troops were put into the U.S. Army, so they lost their state designation and became U.S. troops. But not all of them. How many of you have seen the movie Glory? Raise your hand. It's rated R for required. If you hadn't seen it, I highly recommend it. I rated at about 89.62% on the authenticity scale. There's a lot of mistakes in there, historical inaccuracies, but it's a great movie, tells a story, and it stays pretty close. I think 90% is pretty good for these Hollywood movies because they take a lot of liberties. But it shows what happens with these soldiers that go from Massachusetts. Many of them aren't even from there. They go from different places and enlist in Massachusetts. But they're the 54th Regiment from Massachusetts to go to war. And that's why they're the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. So they are not put into the U.S. Army as a U.S. Army regiment. They are kept as a Massachusetts regiment. And they serve the entire war that way. When you see these American flags on there, I put the U.S. flag when it's a source that comes from a U.S. person. So someone on the Union side. Dr. Steiner is an officer of the Sanitary Commission. He's not a U.S. Army soldier. He's a doctor in the Sanitary Commission. And here's what he says. Here's what I witnessed is what he's telling you. When Jackson's Second Corps moved through Fredericksburg, how many black soldiers did he see in the Confederate Army? He's imagining he saw about 3,000. Now, think about that. This guy had no reason to lie. There was no political correctness back then. There's nothing for him to gain by telling the truth. He said, I saw them, and look what they had supplies, knapsacks, haversacks, canteens, manifestly an integral part of the Southern Confederacy Army. So we get down to the point that I like to make. Why did they serve? What would have driven these men to do it? First of all, patriotism. A lot of these people, unlike today, lived in those states and those communities. Most Americans had never been more than 20 miles from home at the time of the war. The majority of Americans had never been. Why? Because the only way you get there is either ride a horse or walk. There's no cars, there's no buses. Trains were just beginning to get used extensively, so most Americans didn't travel. They believed that states were more important to them. Now, they didn't consider themselves a citizen of the United States. They considered themselves a citizen of New York. And yes, we live in the United States, but they called it the United States really as an expression after the war, because they didn't really feel united. It's just the way it was. They lived in these communities. They didn't have a lot of interface. Remember, telegraph wasn't running to everybody's house. There were no phones. So they were kind of insulated. And they felt patriotic because they belonged to that community. And they wanted to protect their communities. So patriotism had a lot to do with it. One of the black professors Roland Young, wrote this down here. And I think this is so true. Why would blacks serve in the military in the Spanish-American War, in World War I, in World War II, when we had Jim Crow and extensive mistreatment of blacks in the United States? They did it because they were patriotic. They felt like it was their duty as Americans. Even though they were not being treated well, they were still citizens and doing their duty. And the Confederate blacks felt that way about their home. It was their home too. Some of them may have expected rewards. We don't know. There, like I said, no exit poll was conducted after the war. No one went and said, did you expect to get a reward? But some of them were told, if you fight, you will be free. Most famous example, Nathan Bedford Forrest had 44 black slaves on his plantation. He said, men, got them all together. He said, men, we're going off to war. If you come with me, you will get your freedom. Either I will give it to you or the Yankees will give it to you. But if you stay here, you're guaranteed you're going to be kept on the plantation. So he said, you have a choice. All 44 of them said, I'll follow you. And they went off with him. They respected him because he was fair to them. And they stayed with him during the war. There was one killed in action, one taken prisoner. And the only way I know about the prisoner is a good friend of mine, General Scales, who wrote a book about Forrest, told me who the guy was. I wrote his name down. Unfortunately, I don't have it. It doesn't really matter. One of his men was lost. We don't know what happened to him. He disappeared. He probably, after the war, probably went west, became a cowboy. Who knows? But he's gone. One of them was killed in action. But all of them got their papers in 1863, called them together 18 months before the end of the war. He said, men, I may not last. Remember, he was in close combat. He killed 30 men by his own hand in close combat. He said, I may not make it to the end of the war. I'm giving your papers to you now. You're free. What are you going to do? And they said, we'll stay with you. Half of them, after the war ended, went back to the plantation and worked as hired hands. He hired them on. The others went off and did other things. But that's pretty incredible. Here's what happened in the state of Mississippi. Remember, this is 1892. All those men who served as body servants, cooks, teamsters, they'll get a pension just like any other Confederate soldier. Mississippi said they would. Now, not everybody in the South got a pension if they served in the Army, because unlike the North, the Federals paid a pension to all the Union soldiers out of tax dollars. In the South, each state had to pay their soldiers, and many of the states were destitute. So the only way you get a pension is if you were unable to care for yourself, you would get a pension. It was a paltry amount of money, not much. But the black soldiers got a pension. Here it is, right here in Mississippi.
Doesn't that contradict what you were saying, though? A little bit?
Can we wait till the end and talk about that, please?
Just remember that slide.
Yeah. We'll come back to it. Don't forget to ask me. Sense of emotional attachment, again, the blacks felt like that's their home. When the Union forces came in, the Union forces treated many of the blacks as bad as they did the whites in the area. Remember, the first court-martial in the U.S. Army during the war occurred right here, because there was a rape of a black woman by Union troops over in Athens. The soldier was court-martialed. He was punished by being told you're being put in the stockade and something would happen to him, and then he was released. Somebody let him go, and he got away with it. So the blacks saw when the Union troops came in, a lot of times their treatment was worse than what they got by the people they lived around. One of my favorite stories is the Chandler brothers. I call them the brothers. One young black guy and a white guy grew up together. The white boy, Andrew, went off to war. Silas said he wanted to go take care of his friend because they had been playmates growing up. And at the Battle of Chickamauga, Andrew gets wounded, shot through the leg. Silas gets a wagon and drives Andrew back to North Mississippi until he recovers, and then both of them return to the Army. It's a great story. In reward for Silas's fidelity to that family, when the war was over, that black family was given land by the Chandlers that had owned them. They gave them their own land and built them a church for their family. They had a reunion about 25 years ago. Silas's family members had moved, were living in Washington, D.C., the ones they could locate, and the white Chandlers lived in Mississippi, and they had a big reunion. I think that's a great story. Economically, many of them were tied to the South. If the South lost the war, they lost their living. The largest rental landowner in the city of Charleston was a black woman. She rented out rooms and things at boarding houses. If they lost the war, her means would probably be gone too. It probably was, because Charleston was severely bombarded. So they had an economic tie to look out for. And then what I call inexplicable subjective reasons. We don't know why. No one asked them or really went to find out why they served. Were they forced? Yes, some of them were forced to go off and serve. But I found plenty of instances where they voluntarily followed their white friends, masters, to war and actually served with them because they wanted to. There's some cases where they ran away. They were told, no, you can't do it, and they ran away to join their white masters. Who knows? And then war crimes, again, against the blacks in the South. There's a book out that was published probably 32 years ago now, and it's called Union Army Excesses, Army and Navy Excesses in the South. It's a little book. All it is extractions from the official records, the Federal Army records. And it shows all the war crimes committed against the people in the South. And believe me, there's a ton of them in there against the blacks who lived in the South. They were mistreated. And it's official records. No one in the South wrote this. It was written by the U.S. military and recorded their own crimes. So you can go to the official records. That book on the crimes is pretty extensive, and it shows all the things that were done, many of it to black people in the South. So they would fight because they didn't want that happening to them. At the end of the war, February 1865, General Grant says, capture them quickly before they can be put into service. I have a friend who lives down in Florida. He's a Korean War veteran. That's his great-grandfather on the far right with the star on it. His name is Lewis Nelson. His grandson is a friend of mine who is Nelson Winbush, his descendant, Korean War Army veteran. He was a military policeman. He lives down in Kissimmee, Florida now. He's getting on up there. He doesn't travel as much, but I met him several years ago. Unimpeachable resource here. How many of you have seen the movie Gettysburg? Okay, I recommend it to you. I rate it R for required. Again, Hollywood takes some liberties with it. It doesn't follow the history exactly, but it's close. It's based on the novel. So in the movies, remember the British officer that's in there? Kind of a twerpy little guy, he drinking his tea with his finger out. I mean, that's stereotype. If you look up that guy that was there, this fellow right here, Colonel Arthur Fremantle, was a huge man. He wasn't a little twerp like they show in the movie. He was huge. Coldstream Guard, you had to be a minimum of 6 feet tall. This guy looked like a bear. He had mutton chop and a huge mustache. He looked like a mean guy. I wouldn't mess with him. In the movie, that's not what he looks like. But this fellow here lives in Florida. He's a British guy. He portrays Fremantle at a lot of programs, and he goes around and gives talks on it. Fremantle went back to England, wrote a book, 3 months in the Confederacy, or Confederate States, and he says right here, he saw black soldiers, unsupervised, no one had a pistol to their head, bringing in Union prisoners. Why would this British officer lie if it wasn't true? Why would he say that? In Canton, Mississippi, there's a monument to black Confederates. It's the partisan rangers that were raised there. If you don't know what a partisan ranger is, they are people that fight behind the lines, but they are inducted into the Confederate Army. Partisan Ranger Act of 1862 allowed men behind the lines, like Frank Gurley from right down the road here in Gurley, Alabama, to raise units and fight behind the lines. They were official Confederates. They were not guerrillas, although they used guerrilla tactics. They then had also guerrillas who were not sanctioned by the Confederate Army, and a lot of times they would attack Confederate as well as Union. So there's a difference. Partisan Rangers, this is a partisan ranger unit. This is a monument in South Carolina. When I retired from the Army in 1997, I moved to South Carolina. I said, I'm just up the road about 20 miles from where Mr. Sartor lives. So I called his number, and unfortunately he died about 6 months before I got there. And I said, do you have that sword, the saber, cavalry saber he carried during the war? And his wife said, no, we think the son got it. And unfortunately, the son didn't have the interest Joe Sartor did, and we don't know where that saber went to. I hope it was preserved, but Joe Sartor had his grandfather's cavalry saber carried during the war as a cavalryman. You can see the black Confederate with the star on him there, Richmond. And that is inscribed on the memorial in Arlington that we hope is going to be replaced. So this is the Arlington Memorial. It's called Reconciliation Memorial. It was built by the first Jewish graduate of VMI who served in the Confederate Army. World-renowned sculptor, very famous guy. Educated in Europe, went around the world. This was his masterpiece. He said, when I die, I want to be buried at its base. And he was. It sat in Arlington National Cemetery after being dedicated by the Union and Confederate veterans with President Woodrow Wilson in 1914. It was removed in 2023 in December, torn down. And we've been fighting a legal battle to get it back. Secretary of War Hegseth said, put it back. So we're hoping it's going to be reassembled and put back in Arlington. but it's a beautiful memorial. And the reason it was torn down, people that didn't know their history said we're offended it has a black soldier on it and a black maid or mammy holding a baby. That reflected what this man, who was a Confederate soldier, saw at the time. He put what he saw: a Confederate soldier who's black marching in the unit and a black mammy. That's part of the history. And they said they were offended. So Leonard Haynes, this doctor, Southern University, black historian, said when you eliminate the black Confederate soldier, you've eliminated the history of the South. They are part of our story, they're our culture, they are our people. And as a Southerner, I feel compelled to say, you know, all the veterans organizations I belong to, I have a kinship with them. I have a kinship with these men because they served with my ancestors. They fought alongside them. There's written records, photographic records, and the physical remains. I thought it was kind of ironic. That's Madison, Georgia, where that headstone is, and there's hundreds of them around like this. It says on there, unknown colored soldier. There's hundreds of unknown soldiers. We didn't have dog tags back then, and the remains left on the battlefield. You know, if they had a note, they pinned it to themselves. Otherwise, that's why you go to these huge cemeteries, and most of these soldiers from the war are unknown. There were no ID tags back then, and they buried them quickly to prevent disease. I love this photograph. Tutwiler Hotel down in Birmingham caused a stir a couple of years ago. Someone came in, that photograph was hanging on the wall. It shows a reunion of the soldiers in 1916. Notice the blacks are there. No one, I've looked hard. Do you see a pistol to their heads making them come to the reunions? No, of course not. They come because they're valued members of the unit. Now, racism existed. Notice they're standing in the back. Okay, that's the way it was. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it was. But at least they came. No one made them go to the reunions. They felt compelled to go because they were veterans. That was their organization. Those were their friends. And people who have served in war have a special bond. And these men felt that bond. And sadly, you know, yes, there was racism. Yes, they were mistreated. But these men didn't feel that inside their organization, their unit. They felt like they were part of the unit. A lot of people say, look, there's Monroe Gooch in his Confederate uniform. No, no, no. That's called a reunion suit or a reunion uniform. After the war, they had suits made of gray because the uniforms were in bad shape. They stunk, they were nasty, they were torn up, frayed. They had these reunion suits made. They were made of gray to sort of look like uniform. On the other side, the Grand Army of the Republic, Union soldiers did the same thing, blue suits. That's what he's wearing. He's wearing a reunion uniform. And we know it's in the 1870s because of the style of the cap is the 1873 kepi that the Army used. So this is long after the war is over. A few years ago, I'd say a few, it's about 2003, a friend of mine, Bob Harrison, who's there on the left, a black historian, was down in Darlington, South Carolina. They were celebrating Henry Dad Brown, who had served not only in the Mexican-American War, but in the Confederate Army during the war between states as a drummer, a musician. Guess what the regulations of the Confederate Army said? They will be paid exactly as a white musician. So they got the same pay. Soldiers didn't. Black soldiers in the U.S. Army for 18 months after 1863 got only 2/3 the pay of white soldiers, until they complained so loudly they made it right and paid them exactly what they paid the white soldiers. Here's a post-war photograph. Again, this is another corpse according to Dr. McPherson, but he's holding his fife years after the war. Over in Atlanta, this young man leading the parade is a black musician. He was a National Guard soldier. He was a staff sergeant. Shortly after this photograph was taken at that parade, he was murdered in a robbery, and that's his grave. He said, I want 2 flags on my headstone. I want the U.S. flag, and I want the Confederate flag to symbolize my tie through my ancestors to the Confederacy, and the U.S. flag for my service to my country. And that's his headstone in Atlanta. Richard Quarles served in a Florida unit, I'm sorry, in a South Carolina unit, but buried in Florida. And if you go to the Rose Cemetery in Florida, it talks about his Confederate service on that sign, and he's buried right there, and they went and honored him with a veteran's headstone with the family. Worry Clyburn in North Carolina, just a few years ago, they found out that he had Confederate service. The family said, who can help us get a headstone? The son's Confederate veterans said, we'll get the headstone, we'll have a ceremony for him. And there they are, presenting a flag to the descendants. Well, something happened to my slides. Internet ate them. I had a great picture here of Willie Casey, a friend of mine who's a retired Army officer, also a descendant of black Confederates, does reenactments and living history, has a picture of him in his uniform. H.K. Edgerton, unfortunately, died 2 days ago. He's a good friend of mine. Great American, Army veteran during Vietnam. He passed away, severe heart problems down in Florida, and he'll be missed. Tyrone Williams, the man over here, retired federal deputy. I got to be good friends with him in Kansas. I have a friend of mine called me up one day, said, hey, sir, you got to see this. There's this guy driving a pickup truck around Leavenworth, Kansas with a Confederate tag on the pickup truck. I said, okay, is he the local redneck? What is it? He said, no, he's got Confederate stickers on the back of his window on his truck. I said, well, okay. He said, you won't believe this. I said, try it. He said, he's black. I said, really? In a Union town, that's pretty gutsy. He said, but he's got a police uniform on. I said, wow, that's really cool. I said, where did he go? He said, I followed him. He went to the University of St. Mary in Leavenworth, Kansas. I said, well, golly, it's 6 o'clock at night, what's he doing? He got out and went in the security office. So he's the security for campus. So I said, hang on, I'll be right there. So I jumped in my truck. I lived out in the county, drove, broke the speed limit, got down to town. About 30 minutes later, went to the university. No one's there. One truck sitting outside the security office on main campus, and it's got all these stickers and a Confederate tag on it. I said, whoa, this is wild. So I went into the office. There's this big, I'm talking about, he is like 6.5 feet tall. He's a big man. In a police uniform, sitting there, and he has a gun. I said, sir, is that your pickup truck? And he stood up, and I mean, he's like huge. He could have crushed me like a grapefruit. He said, yes, do you have a problem with that? I guess people have given him a hard time. I said, no, sir, I do not, especially since you're packing heat. I said, I want to talk to you. He had a big binder there. He was doing genealogy while he was at the desk, just doing his job. So we got to talking, got to be great friends. His phone rang. You know what his dial tone was? Dixie. I said, have you ever heard of the Sons of Confederate Veterans? He said, no. I said, I'd like to join you. So he joined our camp. And I said, have you got a headstone for your ancestor? He said, no. He's buried in Arkansas on our old farm. So we ordered his headstone. I said, I'll make a deal with you. This is in August. I'll make a deal. I will go help you put that headstone in, but we're going in the wintertime. No snakes, no mosquitoes. So I drove down in January, and we dug his headstone in, put it on his ancestor's grave. He's very proud of his ancestor. And he had all the genealogy work. So when I took him to the National Cemetery, the director, who I knew, we weren't friends, but I knew him, I said, sir, my friend here wants a headstone for his ancestor who served in the Civil War. He said, oh, well, you'll want one of these. He took him over, and there's all these Union headstones. You know the difference between the two? Union are like the ones today. They're round top. And then they have the Confederate, which are almost identical, but they're pointed. See, there's a little point. You know why they put a point on them?
Sit on them.
So the Yankees wouldn't sit on them.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's a true story. I read it on the internet. So we went and got his headstone. It was delivered down there, and I drove down with him. We went out, put the headstone in, and he was so happy. He said, I'm so glad that we were able to recognize him. Anyway, great story. He still lives up there. He's in a full care facility now. He's gotten on up there. Retired federal marshal, a great American, really nice man. And that's when we inducted him into the Sons of Confederate Veterans. So going back to that picture, remember that picture I showed you, Louisiana, 1861? Here's what happened. Those were a Southern militia pre-war. They were all black because in Louisiana, race didn't mean the same as it did in the other states. It was much, because of French influence, blacks could do much more in Louisiana. In New Orleans, they had their own black militia. 1861. What happened is when Butler came in to New Orleans and occupied it, he said, okay, men, you have a choice. You either go to POW camp or you're going to join the U.S. Army. A lot of them said, where do we sign? So many of them switched over to the U.S. Army and did service for the U.S. Army. But that's them in Southern service up there in the upper left. What they did is they used their picture and made a recruiting poster. I call it propaganda. Notice what they did. The same soldiers, and the artist quickly added a little drummer boy, put a U.S. flag and a camp scene and a U.S. officer there. But those pictures, those are the same men. But it was used for U.S. propaganda to enlist black soldiers in the U.S. Army. 44 of them that went off to war, 42 survived. Some of them were even armed and in his personal escort because the commanders usually have an escort to protect them. We do that today, even in the Army today. How many of you seen the movie Ride with the Devil? If you hadn't seen it, highly recommend it. Tobey Maguire plays a Confederate guerrilla, but it's very well done. It's a fictional account of what happened on the border between Missouri and Kansas and the raid on Lawrence. One of the most famous black soldiers that served in that unit was a man named John Nolan. He went to all the Confederate reunions after the war. He was extremely respected by his white comrades, and there you see him, 1906, probably the last one he went to. Here's pictures during the war. Just found, that picture on the left was only found about 15 years ago, along with a bunch of others of those guerrillas. There were about 7 black guerrillas that rode with Quantrill. He was sent to Lawrence to scout Lawrence before the big Lawrence raid, because no one would suspect him. He'd be like a free black in Lawrence. So he did the scouting there, and that's him on the right long after the war's over. Some other black journalists who are into Southern heritage, Stanley Lott and J.J. Johnson. And here's a Florida legislator talked about, we got a lot more problems than trying to go after monuments and flags because blacks served in the Confederate Army. That's their heritage too. And I always ask, for my fellow Southerners, do we allow their honorable service to go forgotten or not? They need to be remembered just like any other soldier. I just summarize the talk and say, here's how we know there's black Confederates in my mind. Whether you believe it or not, I'd like to go back to what that black lady said. You don't have to believe me. Go do your own research. Written evidence from the U.S. and foreign sources like Fremantle. Federal first-hand primary accounts in the official records of the United States military. Southern state pension records. I have the pension records of 2 soldiers that come from Little Town of Liberty, where my grandfather was from, down on the border with Louisiana. What happened is somebody cut their pension record off, we don't know why, but my ancestor, who was the clerk of court, said, restore it. They were both needing pensions. They deserved it. They earned them during the war. And we got the letter that shows. Photographic evidence. We have the images, the photographs made during and after the war. We have the physical evidence. Their miraculous appearance at veterans reunions without being forced to go. No one had a pistol to their head. They did it because they wanted to be there. Physical evidence, documentation, headstones with their information on it. And then I say logic, common sense, and reason based on intellectual study. I say, I've studied this now. I'm convinced. I've seen the stuff. I hate to use the religious analogy. I put my hand in the side of the Savior. I've seen the stuff. I know, and I've talked to people who are descendants of black Confederates. They know their ancestors fought for the Confederacy. And that's just the way it is. It's a fact.
There are service records in the National Archives.
Yep. Okay, I've gone over I apologize. We had some comments and questions. Sir, let me get back to you, please.
I'm good. I'm good.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Sir?
Yeah, in Virginia, some of the freed slaves had their own slaves. In fact, I've read accounts where they had quite a few.
Yeah, there's a new book out, just got published about a month ago on them.
Were there southern states like that, where, you were like, and then service, and once you were free, or was your law against it in some states?
You're getting into an area that I can't give a definitive answer on. I can speculate, I can say yes, but I don't know the circumstances. Yes, sir.
We know General Patrick Claiborne, towards the end before he died at Franklin, he argued the fact that the South should enlist some of the freed slaves or free slaves and enlist them in the Army, and he was shot down by Army Governor
Absolutely.
Grass.
Yes.
So were the majority of these guys who served, were they approved locally by smaller unit commanders?
Yes, exactly. When you're in combat, you don't care who's carrying the musket. If they're helping you out, you don't care. So it's a great point. General Patrick Claiborne in January of 1863 proposed to the Confederate government, wrote a letter. It was suppressed. It was a dangerous idea to arm blacks in the South. He died in November 1863 at Franklin. The idea died, we thought, and then in March of 1864, January 64, in November 64, he died at Franklin. And then in March 1863, the Confederate government said, officially, we can enlist them. Too late. But the unit commanders at the lower level said, heck with the regulations. You know how that works in the Army. You know, whatever works, works. So they were taking them in, even though it was not officially sanctioned, and letting them serve. And they supported them. They got donations from the officers. They fed them. They clothed them with Confederate supplies, Army uniforms. They did what was necessary. And it's like Colonel Freeman of the British Army said, they're out there on the firing line, and that soldier that was bringing the prisoners back, no one was supervising him. He had a musket, and he was bringing Union prisoners into the line. So they did what was necessary at the time. So good point, yes. Sir?
I think also as a compliment to what the question just was, the units, as you said earlier, were run by the states. They weren't run by the Confederate government. So the states could do what they want and enlist all the soldiers they needed to fill up their ranks. And to speak to General Claiborne's ideas, proposing to the government that they do this, it wasn't the national government that was in charge of any of it. It was the state government.
Yeah, and remember, Confederates fighting states' rights, we don't like being told what to do. They didn't like the Confederate central government. They only tolerated it because they were at war. And a lot of them said, when the war's over, we're not doing this. Remember, the governor of Georgia, John Brown, said, we are not doing what you say because we want this food for ourselves. We're not sending it to Virginia. And so a lot of the governors, Vance in North Carolina, same way. He got uniforms in that were supposed to go to the Confederate Army. He kept them for himself, but he did give them, as Longstreet's Corps went to fight at Chickamauga as they came through North Carolina, he issued out some of the uniforms to re-equip Longstreet's Corps. But he said, those are mine, not the government's. So states' rights played a big part in this, and yes, they didn't have to do what the Confederate government said because, remember, they said, we don't like being told what to do. It just goes against the grain of why they formed. Sir.
I'm from Delaware, as you may know from my accent. But Fort Delaware was a large Confederate prison, and I did a lot of study on it. I actually was aware of it helped restore some of the facilities there. Those have been disrepaired. After World War II, it was kind of abandoned. All of course, the Confederate barracks rotted away. They were wooden. But in the documentation, they offered a lot of the prisoners to serve on some of the guns. They had a lot of guns there, and they were understaffed, the Union Army. So they said, we'll give you 3 meals a day if you take the oath and serve the Union on the guns, because they knew the Confederacy wasn't going to sail Navy up there and attack, Philadelphia or whatever. So, but in the documentation, a lot, matter of fact, I don't know of any, a lot of the black POWs refused to take the oath. And that surprised them, and it's documented. They said, we gave our word to serve their state of the South.
Yes.
And their word, in our culture, your word doesn't mean a whole lot. But in those days, on both sides, your word meant a lot. But they had over several hundred white Confederate soldiers join the Union Army. It took to get the 3 meals a day.
Yep.
Because they were typically only getting 2 if things were good, and 1 if things were bad. But the Union soldiers all got 3 full meals a day.
Yep,
So,
you do what you have to do to survive.
but the blacks refused.
Well, Tyrone Williams, my friend who was a federal deputy marshal, his ancestor was captured near the end of the war, sent to Chicago, terrible prison camp there. Soldiers were dying right and left. They came by and said, if you will enlist in the U.S. Army and go west and fight the Indians and not have to fight against the Confederates, we will give you 3 square meals a day and pay you. And his ancestor signed up, got on the train to go west, and somewhere between the post where he was supposed to be and Camp Douglas, he disappeared. He went AWOL. He deserted, really. And he ended up back in North Carolina, got his family, and moved to Arkansas, and that's where he died. He was kicked by a mule in the chest, I think it was 1903, while he was plowing. But yeah, that's exactly right. Food is a incentive for sure. Okay. Yes, sir.
During the 1913 reunion at Gettysburg, black Confederates showed up, and they were told
By the U.S. Army.
by the U.S.
Yeah.
You can't stay here. We don't have provisions for you. And the Confederate veterans said, no, they're staying with us.
Yep.
And they were brought into the Confederate camp.
Yep. Remember, the U.S. military freed the slaves, but it didn't make them equal. 1948, President Truman, the descendant of a Confederate soldier, member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, wrote Executive Order 9981. He said all military will be integrated. It was all segregated until then. That's not right. And so President Truman integrated the U.S. military, and his ancestors were Confederates. They had been abused by the Yankees on the Kansas-Missouri border. So, big step for him.
One more.
Sir?
Got a half brother, he found out on his side of the family, blacks was in the Confederate.
Yeah, it's amazing what you find you start doing this research. And that's what I tell people, Peggy Towns' book, if you hadn't got it, it's called Duty Driven, The Plight of North Alabama's African Americans During the Civil War. Great book, really interesting. And oh, by the way, if you go downtown to the plaza down there, the Veterans Plaza, her ancestor has a large photograph on one of the kiosks down there and tells his history. So it's got a picture of a black first sergeant. Her ancestor was a first sergeant, and he's in that kiosk on the pictures there, which is pretty cool. We got more questions? Yes, sir.
Now, could you make a couple of comments about Colonel Turchin and what he did in Athens?
Yes, Colonel Turchin's the one who went over to Athens and sacked Athens, and one of his soldiers raped one of the black women there and was court-martialed. Turchin was then court-martialed for the sack of Athens. And unfortunately, fortunately, the court-martial board, the U.S. Army said, you're out of here, you're out of the Army. On the way back to Chicago, President Lincoln promoted him to brigadier general and said, you're back. So he continued committing war crimes for the rest of the war, and the rest of the U.S. Army said, well, if he can do it, then we can do it. So what he did in Athens, there's an excellent book written by 2 lawyers from New York on the sack of Athens. I highly recommend it. Great book. Talks about the court-martial and why his soldiers did what they did. Very interesting.
One more thing for you.
Yes, sir.
You did such a good job studying the Confederate. I want to give you this presentation of Union Blacks. I want to give this to you at your library.
Well, thank you very much. What regiment is it?
I don't know, but the person that done it is actually painting. They painted it.
That's very cool.
It reminded me of the movie Glory.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to count the stars, see if you got them right. That's beautiful. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Do you? Oh, you mean there's a copy? This isn't as valuable? Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very nice. Before we get out of here, I have two things to give out real fast. Number one, my good friend, Colonel Dr. Guthrie, who is a great historian, VMI graduate, just a great all-around gentleman, actually has a period cannon. Now, who has a period Civil War cannon in their garage? Okay. He's such a great artillery officer that I thought I'd get him this. So, Colonel Dr. Guthrie, sir, here's your own artillery flag to go with your cannon, okay? Okay,
That's what I get for being late, right?
that's your consolation prize. And,
Thank you.
okay, the reason I drove 5,000 miles over 15 days to get back up here and give this presentation, I didn't do that. It's only a couple hours down the road. Is because my good friend Gil White, who I've known for years, great historian, great genealogist. We love talking genealogy and boring each other to tears about our families, but it's fascinating stuff. I just found out that he had ancestors that fought in the 4th Alabama Infantry, which was raised around here. It's a local unit, very famous unit. It exists today. The lineage goes to the 167th Infantry, Alabama National Guard. And I have a guy that I have make flags, and I had a copy of the 4th Alabama flag that they carried into battle, copied and made. And I'm going to give this to Gil since he has all those ancestors. And the cool thing about this flag, this is the flag they carried the first year they fought during the war. And then it came home. It's in the Alabama archives down in Montgomery. But the cool thing about this flag is it was designed by Nicola Marshall. Anybody know who Nicola Marshall was? Sir, who was Nicola Marshall?
Well, I know he was instrumental in the design of the early flags. He was an artist.
He was an artist. He lived in Marion, Alabama. He designed the unit out of Marion called the Marion Light Infantry, and this flag was adopted as the regimental flag for the entire 4th Alabama. So it started off as a company flag for the unit out of Marion, because each county provided units to the regiments, and so on the back of it, it has Marion. But Nicola Marshall was a very famous Prussian artist that lived in Marion, Alabama. He designed the battle flag. When they needed the battle flag design, what we call the Southern Cross, people mistakenly call it the Stars and Bars. It's not. This is essentially the stars on the back side, but the Stars and Bars have bars of red, white, and red. So this would be the Stars and Bars, only the stars are on the back side, and they got a large twig of cotton. But this is what the 4th Alabama carried into combat the first year of the war. So I want you to take this flag, sir, guard it with your life. You're very welcome.
Thank you. The books are up here, the books are up front.
They're not for sale. Don't walk off with them, please. I got air tags on them. Thank you all for inviting me tonight.